Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here on this lovely spring day at the end of the semester. I'm John Unsworth. I'm the University Librarian and Dean of Libraries, and on behalf of the UVA Library and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello, I'd like to welcome you to the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library for the 2022 Thomas Jefferson Foundation Distinguished Lecture. The lecture series was created in 2001 through the generosity of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and with the express purpose of bringing eminent scholars here to grounds to discuss topics related to Jefferson. Over the years since, the series has welcomed historians such as Linda Colley, a fellow of both the British Academy and the Royal Society of Literature, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Annette Gordon-Reed, and Andrew O'Shaughnessy of UVA, Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies and Professor of American History, who gave the lecture in 2017. We took a break for some reason in 2020, but we returned virtually last year with Professor Jane Kamensky of Harvard, and I'm delighted that we're able to host you all in person today. The series is managed today by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, the UVA Library, and the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. And I'd like to thank those whose collaboration makes this possible, including Alan Taylor, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair in the Corcoran Department of History, and also a Pulitzer Prize winner. Andrew O'Shaughnessy, just mentioned as Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies and Professor of American History. And Max Edelson, Associate Professor in the Corcoran Department of History and Co-Director of the UVA Early American Seminar at Monticello. And thanks to all of you for being here today. I know you're going to enjoy today's lecture, and I hope you'll continue to support Monticello and the History Department and the library here at UVA. Only with the help of supporters like you are we able to host this kind of programming. Today's speaker, Joanne Freeman, is the class of 1954 professor of American History and American Studies at Yale University. She's a leading expert on early American national politics and political culture, and a fellow of the Society of American Historians. She's also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and has won fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Dirksen Congressional Research Center, and the Library of Congress, among others. She's written op-ed pieces for the New York Times, and her articles have appeared in a wide range of academic journals. She's appeared in numerous documentaries and radio programs on PBS, the History Channel, NPR, and BBC. She's an active public historian, working with high school history teachers and students, giving frequent public lectures, and in the past 2 years, working as a historical consultant for the National Park Service in the reconstruction of the Alexander Hamilton Grange National Memorial. Dr. Freeman is the author or editor of a number of books, the most recent of which, Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic, from Yale University Press, won the Best Book Award from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. Finally, she earned her PhD here at the University of Virginia. So please join me in welcoming back Dr. Joanne Freeman for the 2022 Thomas Jefferson Foundation Distinguished Lecture, Decoding the Founding Truths, Lies, and Myths.
Thank you for that introduction and for coming here to be here this afternoon during this talk. It is an absolute pleasure. I've said this a lot of times already. Always a pleasure to have a reason to be back here in Charlottesville. Since I haven't really been traveling around a lot, given those 2 unfortunate years of the past, it's very nice to have one of the first things I'm doing being here. Now, I'm going to admit, and I was sort of already outed during the introduction, when I came to UVA as a grad student, I was a specialist in the study of Alexander Hamilton. I had been studying him for almost 2 decades at that point, and at times, being a Hamilton expert at Mr. Jefferson's University was interesting. On occasion, it was even dramatic. Twice, I gave public talks here in Charlottesville that dealt with the realities of America's founding period, the nuts and bolts realities of politics on the national stage in the 1790s, in both cases, including some ground level discussion of Thomas Jefferson's politics, for better and worse, and twice a sudden thunderstorm blew up during my talk. I swear. And I actually, in sitting here, realized there are no windows here. So we're safe. I won't be able to tell if a sudden thunderstorm rises up. Now, of course, being a Hamilton expert at Mr. Jefferson's University did more than make me watch for thunderstorms. It compelled me to really think about my assumptions about America's founding. For one thing, it made me question general assumptions that many of us have about a kind of good guys versus bad guys narrative about early American history. And often for people that boils down to Hamilton versus Jefferson. Jefferson's the good guy, Hamilton's the bad guy, although the certain musical on Broadway has complicated that somewhat. As tempting as a good guy, bad guy narrative can be, early American politics was about clashing and melding and occasionally compromising. And it was the melding of voices and ideas that mattered. So much more complicated, much more interesting than a good guys versus bad guys narrative. Being a Hamilton expert here at UVA also forced me to get beyond ethereal ideologies. In a sense, it can be easy to look at clashing ideas and different visions of the new American nation. And in my years of teaching at Yale, I can say that high school teachers are still taught a Hamilton versus Jefferson narrative, in many cases with a column on a board that says, here's what Jefferson thought, and a column on the board that says, here's what Hamilton thought. So ideology, visions for the nation, and that's really what the founding era boils down to. As a scholar, I wanted to go a lot deeper than conflicting ideologies, and I definitely wanted to go beyond clashing personalities. I wanted to go beyond Jefferson and Hamilton. So in the end, I wound up approaching politics in a distinctive kind of way. I wanted to understand how early national politicians understood their political world. I wanted to understand their assumptions about how politics should work. I wanted to understand the unwritten rules that they were following in their politics, and I wanted to know how these things, these largely invisible things, these understandings and assumptions, shaped the period's politics. Now, I realize these are big, broad, vague ideas that I'm pursuing here, but in fact, those kinds of questions about how people at the time understood what they were doing, are vital questions to ask in the study of history. They force us to challenge our present day assumptions about the past. And we assume a lot about the past generally, but particularly about the founding, perhaps more than we realize. And that's some of what I'm going to be discussing today. Strip away some of those assumptions, and the founding looks very different. And those differences can reveal a lot about not only the past, but about what it can offer us in the present. So in a sense, that's what I want to do with you this afternoon. I want to talk about some of the assumptions that we impose on the founding when we look back from the present, our mindset, and then I want to explore some of the ideas and assumptions that the founding generation itself had about their work and their world looking forward in time. We know the end of their story. Obviously, they didn't. And as I'll discuss today, that change in vantage point makes an enormous difference in how we understand America's founding and its implications. Okay, so let's begin by looking at some of the things that many people assume about the founders and the founding. First, and probably most common, it can be very tempting to see America's founding as a golden period of virtuous, selfless founders thinking only of the common good. To basically see the founding as a providential time out of time, a period of demigods. I joke with my students that many of them probably assume that the founding period was a time when you had a lot of lofty men standing around in a lot of rooms, essentially speechifying and doing this. But somehow in their mind, that's what the past looks like, is orators of various sorts pontificating. That could be a comforting way of looking at the founding. Basically shows us the founding as we want it to be. Because what we want We want a story of exceptionalism. We want superhuman heroes. We want a unified founding message that we can apply to the present. We want ideological absolutes. We want all of these things. But they don't do justice to what was really happening at the time, and that matters. In truth, the founding era was anything but golden, and the founding generation knew it. They didn't see their work as a moment out of time. Quite the opposite. Rather, they saw their political work as a starting point, a process put in motion, an evolving process that future generations would have to revise and sustain. And they made that point, that the founding wasn't a time of providential perfection, again and again. John Adams believed that to the core of his being, that the founding was a process put in motion and not a moment out of time. And in his old age, he devoted quite a lot of time and effort into making that point. Because within decades of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, people were already imagining the revolution and the writing of the Declaration as a superhuman moment of creation. And to confirm their hopes about what they wanted those moments to be like, a lot of people wrote to various founders with wondering questions about iconic moments and accomplishments. Basically, there were a lot of letters being written, not just to Adams, but to Jefferson and others, asking, tell us what it was really like. Tell us what really happened, with a kind of awestruck tone. And when you read these letters, you can feel the yearning of these people, what they want the founding to be. Like a lot of other surviving founders in his old age, Adams received an ongoing flow of letters from strangers who really wanted to know what really happened. Now, Jefferson received a lot of those sorts of letters too, particularly in his old age, but he did not relish the task of answering them. In one letter to Adams, he complained about it, griping that, quote, from sunrise to 1 or 2 o'clock, and often from dinner to dark, I am drudging at the writing table. And all this to answer letters into which neither interest nor inclination on my part enters, often for persons whose names I have never before heard. Jefferson called this, quote, the burden of my life. In 1822, he estimated that in 1820, he had received 1,267 letters. At one point in a letter to Adams, he clearly reached a low point. I'm offering this to you as a handy Jefferson quote, which you can pull out on many occasions, and you can say, as Thomas Jefferson said. He was very upset at the fact that he had to keep answering these letters, and he wrote to John Adams and said, quote, is this life? Handy quote that you can use in many situations and say, Thomas Jefferson said. Adams seems to have taken the chore in hand, and in letter after letter, he brushed aside the wonderment and awe, insisting again and again that there was nothing magical or superhuman about the founding. It wasn't a golden moment out of time. For example, in response to one letter asking about the great accomplishments of the Continental Congress, Adams replied, every measure of Congress from 1774 to 1787 inclusively was disputed with acrimony and decided by as small majorities as any question is decided these days. So in essence, he's saying there's no great surge of patriotism. We were figuring things out and not everyone was thrilled about what we were doing, and things were happening by very tiny margins. As far as iconic revolutionary moments were concerned, even those weren't as glorious as they seemed decades later, again, as Adams was quick to point out. In one letter, he recalled what he was thinking as he watched his fellow Continental Congressmen sign the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, I could not see their hearts, but as far as I could penetrate the intricate foldings of their souls, I then believed, and have not since altered my opinion, that there were several who signed with regret, and several others with many doubts and much lukewarmness. The signing of the Declaration of Independence, as Adams is describing it here, is not the product of an enormous burst of unanimous revolutionary patriotism. There were people who disagreed, people who caved to the majority, people who weren't sure about what they were doing, or even didn't like what they were doing. Nor was the founding providentially perfect, free of mistakes. Adams had something to say on this count as well. Adams had something to say on a lot of counts. He's a very, I could see Jeff nodding. He did indeed. He did. He's a wonderful, if you're writing about the period and you want someone to speak up and sort of prick every bubble of pretension, John Adams is often the person you can look to. So it's wonderful that all these people were writing to him and saying, tell us about how wonderful it was. And it gave him a chance to say, ha, let me tell you what it really was like. So again, someone writes to him and wants to know about the wonderfulness of the founding. And particularly, tell us about the glories of the founding. Adams says, we do not make more mistakes now in the 1820s than we did in 1774, 75, 76, 77, 78. He's clearly making a point here. 79, 80, 81. He goes all the way up to 1783. It's like we made mistakes. We made just as many mistakes then as we make now. As he put it, it was patched and piebald then as it is now and ever will be, world without end. Nor were revolutionary battlefields any more sacrosanct. As Adams put it, we blundered at Lexington. We blundered at Bunker's Hill. Where indeed did we not blunder except Saratoga and Yorktown? So again and again, you have Adams insisting the founding era wasn't a providential period of perfection. As he said to one correspondent in 1811 in a particularly straightforward way, I ought not to object to your reverence for your fathers, but to tell you a great secret, as far as I am capable of comparing the merit of different periods, I have no reason to believe we were better than you are. Now, all of this denying leads to an obvious question. Why did it matter? Why this insistence on the rather workaday nature of the American founding? In part, it was because the founders and their cohort thought that worshiping the founding era did more harm than good. The revolution had been about beginnings as well as endings, about new traditions, about new patterns of governance, about new constitutions, about new political processes. And these beginnings were supposed to lead someplace. They were supposed to lead to something that would survive and evolve and change over time. They were supposed to connect with what came next. So in essence, the founding was supposed to be a starting point, the beginning of an evolving process of government. And a golden founding does just the opposite. It makes the founding a time apart, a time of absolutes, a high point that can never be reached again, a story imposed by the present on the past. So, what happens if we don't impose our needs and desires on the founding, but instead try to get a sense of how people at the time experienced and understood it? What do we see? And that's where I want to turn next. For one thing, we see contingency. We see the simple fact that people couldn't know if their efforts would work. And I think generally when we look back to the founding, or certainly when many people look back to the founding, I say this to my students all the time too, they see it as a period of courses. Of course there was a revolution, of course the colonies won their independence, of course they wrote a constitution, of course it was ratified and went into effect, of course it worked. But there were no such of courses in that period. When it came to politics, people were innovating. They were grappling with unknowns. They were making things up as they went along. And they were failing. They were clashing. They were protecting their interests and destroying and avoiding. And they were panicked at the idea that the entire enterprise might fail. And there's a wonderful story that really highlights the period's sense of contingency, this idea that one mistake, one slip, and it's all over. And the story comes from a wonderful diary by a Pennsylvania senator in the first Congress named William Maclay. And I have to pause for a moment to say, it's a wonderful diary, right? It's, as a historian, you want people to commit to paper all of the little things that you don't expect people to commit to paper. And Maclay is that person. Right? Maclay writes about his dreams. He writes about the toys he buys his kids. He writes about how he's sitting in the Senate and he hears someone whisper, John Adams needs his wig dressed. Right? He writes everything down, the snack foods that people were snacking on. It's all there. So it's an amazing, amazing document, and it's online, actually, if you're intrigued, about what it really sort of was like to be in that moment in the first Senate when things truly were being made up as they went along. Now, Maclay, in this wonderful diary, notes in 1791 that he had been invited to a dinner party where President Washington was also a guest. Now, Maclay revered Washington. In his diary, he doesn't even use his name all of the time. In his diary, he often appears as the first man. The first man came up to me today. And Maclay, clearly, you could see it in the diary, always felt nervous and clumsy when he was around Washington. Never knew what to say, never knew where to look. His bows were always clumsy, he thought. And we've all had those moments in front of someone who we admire and we want to scurry into the corner of the room. So Maclay goes to this dinner party, enters the room, and who does he find standing by the door but gasp? The first man, Washington. As Maclay described in his diary, his reaction was basically to panic. He writes that he fumbled his way through a very awkward bow, and then, spotting an empty seat across the room, he turned and prepared to hustle away from the terror of George. But as he turned to go, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Washington gesture to Maclay, "Come here and sit by me." Now, Maclay's reaction here is key. He stops where he is, and as he explains in his diary, he thought to himself, what is the right thing to do? If I turn around and take the seat, I'll be kowtowing to the president, which will make him feel like a monarch. And if he feels like a monarch, he may help push the government into a monarchy and ultimately destroy the republic. Okay, so think about that train of logic, right? Accepting a seat from the president will potentially destroy the republic. That's contingency for you. And what does Maclay do? He does not take the seat. He continues walking because he feels that that was the politically proper and safe thing to do in that moment. You know how badly he wanted to take that seat. I will add that at the end of the evening, apparently he got to sit next to Washington anyway, so the story has a happy ending. But the important point there is, think about the assumption on Maclay's part. He is worrying about the national political repercussions of accepting Washington's offer to take a seat. This gives you some idea of the level of anxiety and insecurity that I'm talking about. It really shows you the contingency of that moment up close and personal. Now, looking forward in time from the founding, you also see change. In a sense, more than anything else, the founding was about change. The hope for it, the chance of it, the fear of it, the failures inherent in it, the good and bad implications of it, the legacies of it. And there's a wonderful example of this kind of grappling with change in a document that I actually found here at UVA before there was this wonderful building, when rare books and documents were back in wonderful Alderman Library. And it involves Madison and Hamilton. It describes a conversation that took place with Madison in 1834, when someone came to Madison's home, Montpelier, and mentioned to Madison, and this is in Madison's old age, said, "Mr. Madison, you know, Alexander Hamilton's son," and Hamilton by this point is long dead in a duel, "Alexander Hamilton's son wants to write a biography of his father. And in the biography, he's going to claim that you, Mr. Madison, changed your politics and abandoned Hamilton after working so closely with him on the Constitution during the Constitutional Convention. You changed, and he's going to accuse you of being disloyal, changing your ideals." Now, supposedly, according to this letter that I found, when first told about this, Madison looked pained and said something along the lines of, "No." Seems like a very Madisonian thing to do. Then he said, quote, "I abandoned Colonel Hamilton," or "Colonel Hamilton abandoned me. In a word, we parted upon its plainly becoming his purpose and endeavor to administration the government into a thing totally different from that which he and I both knew perfectly well had been understood and intended by the convention who framed it and by the people in adopting it. Now, to me, that's fascinating, because what you have here is essentially people arguing over whose politics changed, right? Madison, you agreed with Hamilton and now you've changed. What does it mean? And Madison saying, oh no, Hamilton's the one who went veering off in some strange direction. He's the one whose ideas changed. Even at the time, people were trying to find their way through a thicket of change. Contingency, change. In essence, when you push aside an idealistic, glossy kind of founding, you see the things that truly define the period, the things that made it distinctive. You see innovation and ideals and failures and missed opportunities and fatal mistakes. In a word, what you see is process. You see the working of politics for better and worse. Now, I think there's something ironic in the fact that Americans have lost track of that sense of process in the nation's founding. The mobilization, the debate and compromise, the ad hoc nature of the period's politics. Because more than anything else, the founding was about setting a process in motion. The founding generation believed that one of the most significant things that they did for the future of the nation was creating a defined, documented constitutional process and setting it in motion. It's why James Madison took such careful notes during the Constitutional Convention, documenting precisely how the Constitution was made, documenting the process of creating a national political process. Now, we can argue about how we interpret that process, and indeed we always do, but it was the existence of that grounding constitutional process as an anchor that mattered. The founding generation assumed that during moments of crisis to come, this constitutional process would be the key to national survival. Look, for example, at what Jefferson said when asked about the presidential election of 1800 after his victory. And you may remember that was a very fraught election. It was a tied election. There were threats of violence depending on which victor was going to be announced. And after the furor of that election, someone basically wrote to Jefferson and asked, what would you have done if a president hadn't been elected? Or as Jefferson put it, if there had been the non-election of a president, which is an interesting and useful phrase. If there had been the non-election of a president, in that case, Jefferson answered, the federal government would have been in the situation of a clock or watch run down. A convention would have been on the ground in 8 weeks, would have repaired the Constitution where it was defective, and wound it up again. The process was key, and if the constitutional process failed, if a president wasn't elected, a convention and some tweaks to fix flaws in the process would have solved any problems. Now, there's a lot captured in that statement of Jefferson's. He's talking about failures and flaws. He's talking about a system of improving them. In his idea of an instant convention to solve all problems, you see some of the generative energy of the period. You definitely see enormous contingency and change. And despite Jefferson's calm, matter-of-fact tone, you see the very real possibility that the nation's political system would fail. In fact, failure was a fundamental feature of the founding. It was a time of ambitious ideals and colossal failures. Even as they were spouting these ideals, the founding generation was entrenching some violations of them. And obviously, the most clear example of that kind of failure was slavery. Amidst all of the talk of liberty and the rights of man, there was the cold, hard fact of human bondage. And in some ways, Jefferson has come to symbolize this clash of ideals and realities. The man who wrote so movingly about independence and liberty, a kind of poet of the period's most idealistic political rhetoric, lived a life of comfort grounded on the labor of enslaved people. Now, obviously, Jefferson was not alone in those contradictions. No founder absolutely met their ideals. Some tried, some didn't. Some flagrantly violated them. And the same has held true throughout American history and holds true today. Sometimes we have people trying to live up to their ideals. Sometimes we don't. And in many ways, the United States still hasn't quite lived up to the ideals that it has set for itself. Not in the past, not in the present, not yet. This isn't to say that ideals past and present don't matter, because they do. Their generation, their creation can matter profoundly, even when they're not met. But just as those ideals matter, so do our failures to meet them. Because in those imperfections lie vital truths about America. Those imperfections reveal America's founding for the cut and paste construction that it was. They reveal all of the ways in which America wasn't fully defined or even understood at the time. Those imperfections reveal failures and possibilities. They reveal that the founding was not about idealistic absolutes, however desperately we want it to be. In essence, only by pushing past a perfect founding can we see the process of creating the American nation as the slow, grasping, halting, stumbling, even violent process of becoming that it was. And once you understand our cut and paste, all too human founding in its full complexity, once you see the challenges inherent in how the founding was done, you gain a deeper, more guttural understanding of how easily American democratic governance can be undone. Step away from the glossy ideal of a founding, and you see the true fragility of democratic governance, perhaps the most invaluable lesson that the founding can offer us today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have been told that there will be microphones and the possibility of questions, which I do not. Oh, there they are. There is a microphone. Okay. Are there questions? Thoughts, comments, things you're just dying to know? Alan. Oh, okay. Someone over there and Alan.
Okay, no, you can go first. Me first? Yes, go ahead. You've been, to use a word that you've used for a long time, decoding the founding for 40 years now. As you have immersed yourself further and further into the sources and decoded political grammar far beyond the founding period, how do you see that code differently now than you did when you were a graduate student here?
Wow. That's, and I should say, Rob and I, we crossed over in grad school, did we not, when you were here? You were starting, I think, when I was leaving? A couple years. Wow, that's an interesting question. So how has my understanding or decoding of the founder changed? I mean, I suppose part of the answer has to do with some of what I talked about, and that is, I've always been interested in the sort of down and dirty human level of creating, about the assumptions and ideals and emotion that affects what people do in the time, what politics they do and how politics plays out. But I think in recent years, I won't even say how many, but in recent years, I find myself thinking more about implications and surprises and ways in which things go wrong. It's not that I thought they were perfect before I didn't. But I think now I find myself, because of a lot of things that are going on now in the present, much along the lines of what I did here, I find myself looking back to the founding to try and understand, you know, it's a moment of high contingency, of extreme change, when there was great change possible, when there could be failure of an extreme kind. There are aspects of the founding period that echo some of what we feel today. That's certainly not something I thought about when I was in grad school here. And I think those connections between how people behaved in that climate in early America and some of the ways in which we are changing and acting in that environment today, those similarities and differences can be really, really striking. So I suppose in some way I'm doing something I didn't do in grad school at all, and that is connecting the present with the period I study. I really, as a grad student, wanted to like dive into early America and never come out. And in whatever I wrote, I never included other historians' names in the text. I wanted people to go into the 1790s and just stay there with me. And I think now, not everyone has to, but many of us have to draw those connections and think about what they mean.
So this is also a question that connects the past to the present. When I'm speaking with groups and emphasizing contingency and division and conflict in the founding generation, some of the pushback you get is that our civic culture needs to have this founding period of founders who are better than us, who we can refer back to. And so I'm just wondering, what's your response to that kind of pushback, which I'm sure you get as well?
Yes, and when I was writing this, I was like,
Right.
I'm going to get some pushback even here. I'll tell you, I think it's much more inspiring in its way to think about the founding and what went on in that period as a human struggle and not as superhuman people beaming with ideas sort of beaming down that they're putting into play. I don't think that's inspiring. I think that's removed. I think that pulls people away from what went on in that period. And I think, kind of as I alluded to in my comments, that generation of people was assuming the engagement of everyone who came after, right? They were assuming that what they were doing was not special and apart, that they weren't superhuman heroes, although John Adams is particularly good at saying that. I think it's more, if you're looking for things to inspire people or for them to look at this period and take strong feelings away from it, I think realizing that the struggle and the complexity and the mistakes and the goals and the failures, that really shows you what that moment was about. And it's big, right? There's a lot going on. And I think if you really understand that, then the founding in its own way becomes remarkable in and of itself. So I guess that's usually one of the ways in which I come back.
Hi, thanks for your comments. I love them. The passing through of Abraham Lincoln's life in Springfield on my way here to hear your talk, I drove from Utah. And so I'm not from here, but I'm very impressed with all the facilities at Monticello and so forth. But my question is, how did Abraham Lincoln then fit into seeing the glossy version? He, of course, revered Washington. He believed in the founding, the all men are created equal. That was his phrase. And that's stated there at the presidency. How should we think about that in terms of him looking back to some of those who were not slave owners, like the Danas, Francis Dana, for example?
Well, Lincoln is a great example, in a sense, of the kind of outlook I'm talking about here, because as you're suggesting, he had such a deep sense of history and the connection of his time with the history of America and the connection of what he was doing with what previous presidents and other Americans had done before him. So I think that's very true. But I don't think of anyone that we can talk about. Lincoln certainly is not the person who would have stepped forward and said, the glossy, wonderful moment that I'm in, right? He was quite the opposite of that. His sense of history and his connection with that history absolutely propelled him. But I think along the lines of what I'm saying here, on the one hand, he was inspired by what came before, but I don't think he saw it as, again, apart and superior. I think he was looking at a chain of events and a linking of ideas that connected with his moment and that he was drawing wisdom from and advice from more than anything else.
You have a question here, sir?
Joanne, I was taken by your comments the correspondence that Jefferson and Adams were engaged in, especially Adams. And it led me to think about how it seems to me that the founding, I get the impression that I don't want to accuse you of anything, but
Uh-oh.
the founding, didn't end in the 90s. And in fact, it seems to me the founding didn't really end until maybe 1812, if it's ever ended. But that period of the Jefferson presidency, when, after that contentious election of 1800, what Jefferson was trying to do in the 8 years he was president, Madison after him, it seems to me bears some reflection in thinking about the myth making, and especially Jefferson's point of view. Because as you well know, and you've written about it, what he did during his presidency seems to me to have been an effort to carry forward what he thought was the revolution of 1800 and the change and in a way, in his mind, the completion of the founding. And so I'm surprised that you don't legitimately, perhaps, blame Jefferson for starting this myth-making period. I mean, this myth-making.
I don't think I mean to blame Jefferson for starting myth-making.
Well,
now the lightning truly comes.
No, what I'm thinking about is how his, the note-taking, the annas, collecting his papers to prove his interpretation of what happened in the beginning of the federal government. Not he wasn't around during the Constitutional Convention. But that and then arguing with Adams about interpretations of the 90s, which I think that bears some thinking about how that maybe has continued, and maybe Jefferson's, it may be more personalities here. Adams's personality, Jefferson's personality, not so much Madison or Hamilton, and Hamilton, was out of the picture early in all this. So I'm just thinking about how this myth, I mean, it didn't start in the 1950s. It was not a reaction to communism or World War II. As
I say,
it's been with us all along, and so that's why I'm wondering if you don't think Jefferson started it all.
No, I mean, so I don't think they thought they were creating myths, right? I mean, I think Jefferson pulling together his notes and ordering his correspondence in his old age so that it creates a kind of narrative of what really happened. He's doing quite the opposite of creating a myth. He's creating a narrative, but it's one that he feels is true. So all of them in one way or another are constructing narratives of what they think really happened. And just as you're suggesting, they don't agree, they clash with each other, they argue with each other, they use their papers against each other. No, mine says this from 1791. Well, mine says this from 1792. I don't think myth making and narrative creating are necessarily the same thing, I guess is what I would say. And I think Jefferson, as much as he sometimes liked to rewrite history, I think he very much felt that he was exposing something real and true, and not that he was making up a myth at all. I do see, I mean, I talked about some of these people writing to Adams already, like, ooh, tell us about the founding. So they already have a kind of glossed understanding of the founding. But I think over time is how that's grown. I don't think in this time period, people are making that kind of explicit sort of myth-making activity. I think they're writing narratives that they feel are responsible and politically important for the future. That isn't necessarily, to me, the same thing as a myth, if that makes sense. I got a nod. Okay.
Well, I was thinking that not so much of the myth, that Jefferson started the myth, but that his views and others' views of the founding led to the myth making by other people, who cited, or to what high school teachers, how they teach that period now. It's Jefferson's view or Hamilton's view.
Sure.
And Jefferson left us with his view very clearly. And so from that is what I'm thinking has led us in our flawed educational system to want to there is the seeds of the myths are in their papers and in their writing and in their
I could
views, and
say, I
their
agree.
defending
The
of their
seeds,
position. Yeah.
Yeah, that I could go along with. That I agree with.
Thank you very much for these remarks because they are intriguing. And I would like to know if you would share with us a little more on the interpersonal relationships, personalities, egos that you've come across in your research. That is to say, how Jefferson Adams became somewhat separated, as we all know. But, you know, I think for the purpose of your talk, it might be good to know. The second component of this question is, at what point you laid a good bit of responsibility about slavery at the, and rightfully so, but, you know, at what point did Jefferson in particular come up with that thought that was epitomized in his letter known as the Fire Bell in the Night letter, in which he said this thing is not going well?
Well, and that, I mean, that's a big question, Jefferson and slavery. I think you're right to point out that his view changes over time, and towards the end of his life, there's an urgency to it because of the idea of a line being drawn across the country dividing free from slave. But to go back to the start of your question, as far as his relationship with Adams goes, you know, that also evolves over time, right? That they are friends in revolution. The politics of the 1790s pulls them apart. And they are really sort of at odds with each other until a mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, tells each one that the other one wants to be friends again. Crafty. And they each sort of come together believing, oh, you know, he wants to be friends again. And they have a wonderful correspondence in their old age, which is, again, out there and that you can read. It's fascinating because along the lines of what you're suggesting here, they talk about a lot of things in that correspondence that they probably couldn't have talked about before. This actually gets back to some of what you're saying too. They're talking about the meanings of things, and they're talking about some of it is fascinating just because it's kind of quirky, like, you know, the top 5 funerals of the founding period. They're reflecting over this time that they spent together, but they're thinking about meanings and they're thinking about implications. John Adams is being John Adams. So he's arguing and he wants to talk about all of these sort of, you know, let's talk religion next. And Jefferson is not necessarily that eager to engage in that kind of conversation. But if you're looking for, you know, again, something rare and wonderful, which is these two individuals who were immersed in what was going on for so many decades, working it through as friends in their last years and talking about a wide variety of big issues, not necessarily slavery, but still, I highly recommend that because, again, you know, speaking as a historian who loves rummaging around in personal letters, diaries, and correspondence, when you find someone, when you find a moment like that, when they're engaging in a personal reflections of that sort, or when you find a diary like Maclay's, when he's putting down in there, you know, what people don't normally put down, or when you find, you know, my most recent book was about physical violence in the U.S. Congress in the decades before the Civil War. When you find a member of Congress who always stands up and says the thing you're not supposed to say, you're happy for those people because they let you get beyond broad statements about big themes and to get, as sort of what I talked about during my lecture here today, to get down to the wrestling with it and the ways in which people were trying to figure it out as they went along.
Well, thank you for your remarks. And I think your perspective could use more airtime these days. So something to work on. So great story on Madison and Hamilton. And so my question is, who was right? And how do you see their views change over time?
Well, you know, it's interesting because it's not a cop-out to say in a way they're both right. But Madison, I think his take is really worth thinking about. What Madison basically says, and he uses the word administration as a verb in that original document. He says Hamilton tried to administration the government into being something it wasn't meant to be, and apparently he paused and like smiled to himself, like, yes, that's exactly the word I would use for that. You know, he's pleased with the way he used it. I think in a sense that is what Hamilton was trying to do, as far as Hamilton and government was concerned, he was going to push it as to be as centralized and as powerful as he could get it to be, while at least by his count, still being small r Republican in nature, right? But he and Madison could have worked alongside each other, pushing for a stronger government during the Federal Convention, and then Hamilton went on pushing. Again, I don't think necessarily changing. I think the conversation was different between the creating of the document and then the deploying of the document. So, in a way, you could say that neither one changed, I suppose, but really what changed was the context and the implications of what they were doing.
Thank you for this talk today. This has been very interesting. I wanted to ask, I wondered if I could ask you to reflect a bit on the public historical memory, I suppose, of the founding period as opposed to Reconstruction, which is not the historical time period you dealt with, so feel free to answer this however you want. But it occurs to me that as you're talking, that this is the next period where American people really begin to engage in the sort of amending of the Constitution, sort of rethinking of the Constitution some of these founders imagined they would do. And I think that when we generally think back on that period, we think of the folks doing, writing the Reconstruction Amendments, for example, as engaging in a pretty purposeful restructuring of American society. That's something they went in with an idea of what they wanted to fix, and they, accomplished it to one degree or another. And that's obviously true of the founding, as you're talking about. But as you've been saying, we don't think of it that way. We think of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all that as providentially ordained almost. So it occurs to me that this is, the Reconstruction is sort of what they were imagining we would do, but we have a very different memory of how, of what those periods were like, the people involved and all that. So I don't have a specific question, but I was curious if I could, if you could just reflect a bit on that and how we remember those periods differently and why.
Well, and it's a great question because it has to do with how we remember things versus how we see things, right? So, I mean, this is an obvious assertion, but we do generally, people think of or want to think of American history as, getting better all the time, getting better, which obviously it doesn't, right? History doesn't work that way. Pick a subject, and it's always, a sort of evolving up and down process, and that is just as true for Reconstruction as it is for the founding and civil rights in any other period. I think right now we're in a moment where it's important to think about that, right? Because I think it's easy to take stability and stasis for granted and to assume we're in an X kind of a moment and to discover in the middle of that moment that you're not and that there's change happening. In a way, the moment that we're in kind of encourages a really interesting kind of historical thinking, I think, or can encourage that. I think it's interesting to be in going through what we're going through today and think about how that might change how we understand the past. And conversely, to think about how we understand the past, this is more what I was talking about in my lecture. How do the ways that we understand the past, how might that help us better process what's going on now? On Friday mornings, I do a webcast, and essentially that's what I do every Friday morning, is I look at something from the past, I talk about it in the past, and then I pull it into the present and say, well, now that you understand this thing, let's look at what just happened and see how it connects. I guess back actually, Rob, to your question as well. I think we're living in a moment when it's such a moment of such extreme contingency. We have to wrestle with and think historically in a way that we don't necessarily always have to. And I guess that's not necessarily specifically talking about Reconstruction, but it's the same idea, the same kind of a period of change for the better and for the worse. And I think we need to incorporate that into our understanding of American history. And I think right now it would behoove us to be thinking about what we're going through now in the same kind of way.
It's my turn. I wanted to say two things. One is everybody here should hear what you also know from your quote about, is this life, from Jefferson complaining about all the letters he was getting, because you should always give the rest of the sentence where he says, is this life compared to this, the life of a cabbage is paradise. And I just, yeah.
You always have the wonderful ends of all the sentences.
Jefferson is always a good one for a bit of elegant overstatement. But I also just wanted to comment that in terms of myth making in the founding generation, it seems to me that Jefferson, and he's not alone in this, late in life, lay the seeds for it when they're getting nostalgic about the Revolutionary years. Because Jefferson, by the end of his life, and he's far from alone in this, is moaning about how back then everybody put their, shoulder to the wheel, and we were all as one and doing everything, and now everything's falling apart. And I do think that
Nostalgia, right?
that nostalgia is kind of where the seeds of the myth really originate.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. And that also you can see throughout history. If you're in a moment, particularly a moment of change, there's always people who look back and say, "Oh, the good old days," which is part of why I spoke about what I just spoke about, because we do have a lot of people now looking back to the founding and saying, "Oh, that was the moment of glory and everything," and now it's all disaster. It's like, well, no, but it wasn't the moment of glory and everything. There has never been that kind of moment, and if you assume there's that kind of a moment, you do yourself a disservice in understanding what you're struggling with now. So yeah, that's a long way of saying I agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
Professor Freeman, do you have time for 2 more?
Sure.
So I'm hoping you can resolve a tension that I see kind of emerging in some of the things that you're saying. And so when we take the past on its own terms and sort of seek to distance ourselves or try not to impose ourselves on the past, we gain this new understanding of it. But then the second thing I'm hearing you saying is then we apply it to the present somehow. And isn't that reasserting ourselves into the past in its own way rather than taking it on its own terms? And it's just something I'm curious as to how to square the circle.
I think, no, it's a good question. I think learning from the past, looking at what happened in the past and understanding the patterns and the logic of it, you can't directly take that and plant it into the present, but you can definitely learn from it, right? So for example, you can look at the 1790s as a period, particularly the late 1790s, as a period when politics was extremely polarized. You had people on each side accusing the other of basically not thinking like Americans. You had violence in the streets. John Adams uses the word terrorism to describe the late 1790s. It's an interesting moment with, again, a cluster of things that you can also say you see some of in the years before the Civil War. You can say you see similar things in the Civil Rights era. There are moments in American history, I think, when Americans have a sense that there's some larger point being debated, right? 1790s, I think they're really debating about how democratic a government this is going to be. Obviously, the 1850s, it's about slavery. Obviously, the 1960s, we're talking about civil rights. During moments like that, I think there are clusters of behaviors and ideas and emotions that are not the same every time, but that echo. And I think, for example, looking at that and looking at those patterns and then thinking about what that tells us about how we might understand the present, that's an example of not necessarily imposing ourselves on the past, but looking to the patterns of the past to see if they can tell us something about the present.
Hi, thank you for the talk. When you were contrasting the view the founders had of how it was just the beginning of the process was the beginning versus sort of the glorified view that, we were at this high point. I wondered if you see a direct link between some of those views, not the founders' views, but maybe everyone else who was sort of glorifying the Constitutional Convention, et cetera. If you see a direct link between that and sort of the factions within constitutional law today, those that take sort of this originalism is the right term, view of, if it's not in the Constitution, then, we have to be very careful versus those that maybe take it's a living, growing document type of view, or if maybe too much has happened that it's not really that clear a link.
I mean, I think this is what you're asking. I think that you could look at the early period and people sort of asking these questions, tell us about this, tell us about that. Often they're looking for things to be a certain way that will confirm how they want things to be, or will confirm what they want to be true of America. And I think, looking to the past and particularly to the founding, people do that all the time today, whether they're doing it for constitutional or legal purposes, whether they're doing it for cultural purposes. That's a pattern, I guess, that you can see over time. And I think the founding stands out as a period where it's very handy to do that, because it feels like, as I was saying in my comments, feels like this little bubble of a period when, here you have these absolutes and we can go grab them and apply them to whatever we want. They were starting to think along those lines at an early period, but now that's almost the default sometimes. And I just think, it's obvious to say, but that does a real injustice to the actual history and the actual implications and the actual legacies of what went on in the founding.